Welcome, students and viewers. I am Lorna Bracewell, Professor of Political Science at Flagler College, and I am here today with Lori Marso, Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Africana Studies Program at Union College. And we're here today to help me figure out what the heck I'm doing in my Feminist Political Thought class this fall. I'm teaching a course I've never taught before. Of course, I am ostensibly a scholar of feminist political thought. You know, presumably I do it all the time, but as I sat down to prepare my syllabus this semester, I kind of realized, like, what is feminist political thought? How am I going to kind of present this to students? So I immediately thought of some really excellent and illuminating and helpful articles on just this subject that my friend and colleague Lori Marso had written, and I thought, let's get her in a Zoom room and talk this through. What is it? I'm hoping that, Lori, you can help me kind of clarify my thinking, and in the course of doing that, improve the experience my students will have this semester. So, are you game?
I'm game. It's so nice to see you, Lorna. Thank you. Yeah, this sounds like fun, and I'm sure that it'll clarify my thinking as well, which is probably, for all of us, feminism is a really difficult and contested kind of concept. So it's not unusual to have to try to think through it again and again and again and again. And that's a good thing.
It means we're doing it right, hopefully.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
All right. So if I could put you on the spot, what is feminist political thought?
Well, it's so funny when you said that when you started to think about this course, that you were asking yourself, what is it really? How can I explain to my students exactly what it is? When I was asked, but I also just agreed. I don't really remember how it came up, to write these two essays that your students are reading, one on feminism and one on women in Western political thought, for the Encyclopedia for Political Thought. I realized when I was going to write those essays that I had just signed up for this like undoable task, that it was like much bigger and harder than I had imagined. I had thought, oh, I do women in Western political thought, I do feminist political theory, I'll be able to write these essays. And I really had to think hard, and I did so much work on these essays. I reread them again in preparation for this conversation with you, and I'd probably write them a little bit differently now, but it was kind of fun to kind of revisit that thinking that I was doing at that time, and how I decided what was important to include there, and so on and so forth. So I guess just one way to just start out the conversation, rather than give an answer to your question, since I'm just sort of like dodging your question, is to say that one of the ways I decided to start the feminism piece is to just say that there is no feminism, there are feminisms. And so we need to acknowledge that from the get-go, that feminism is absolutely a contested term, and that not only do feminist political thinkers, but also feminist activists, and in media, as we understand it, the word feminism is thrown around all the time. There's not a very stable definition of it, and that is probably, I decided, a good thing, because it again makes us think more and more about what we really are thinking about when we talk about that word, and why gender, race, class, disability, sexuality, and other aspects of our identity are so important to think about and think hard about as we talk about politics. And that kind of brings me to feminist political thought, because feminist political thought is particularly about politics, which is how we decide how we live together, and have conversations about how we will live together. So that's a very long and not concise answer, but it does reflect my own thinking.
Yeah. So as I read your two essays, kind of two currents in this amorphous, motley, contentious thing, feminist political thought, emerged to me. So I'll just kind of tell you what I took, and you correct me or expand. It seems like there's one dimension of feminist political thought is a kind of intellectual project. It's like feminists who do political theory. They read Locke and they read Hobbes and they read Rousseau. They read the quote unquote canonical texts of political theory with kind of feminist questions, a feminist lens, what have you, in mind. So there's this kind of intellectual project that maybe you could expand on what I've just said about that. And then there's this other kind of current that I'm tempted to say is kind of more overtly, expressly political. It's bigger. It's beyond the kind of boundaries of academe and the ivory tower. So could you kind of speak maybe to those, what I'm seeing as kind of two aspects of this thing, feminist political thought?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's insightful, and it's so right to say that there are those two kinds of projects going on in feminist political thought, and that one is intellectual, one is more political. I'm really terrible at obeying any kind of boundaries or distinctions, which I'm sure you are too in your real life and in your work as well, but it's always helpful to think about go ahead, Lorna, sorry.
One of the points you make about feminism is that it is poorly behaved. It doesn't like to respect these boundaries and these categories. It's always making trouble. So
absolutely, yes, so true. I love the way you put that, and I think that's fantastic and something to be celebrated. But of course, as thinkers and writers and teachers and scholars, it's always important to also think about, how do we understand these other aspects? How do they work together? Whether they're intention, and I understand that to be the question you're asking me, and I think that's a really excellent question. So just to say that. I think this idea of canon formation that is part and parcel of the intellectual project for, as you characterized it, feminists who do political theory and who are reading the canon with that kind of critical lens and looking for a number of things. They might be sort of bringing to light the work of forgotten or not recognized women political thinkers, or looking for the gender politics in the canon of male thinkers that we are regularly included. They might be thinking about how gender is constitutive of how the concepts of democracy, equality, security, freedom, justice, all those things we study are how gender is constitutive of how we define those things. They're doing a lot of different things. So they themselves, those feminists who study political thought, and you and I are two of those group, and there are many, are doing all those things when they approach canonical political thinkers, right? And that is all valuable work. The reason it's really valuable work, I think, and in all those iterations, is it helps us to think critically about what a canon is, why that canon was established, and most important, I think, and here I think it relates to the more political aspect that you talked about, it helps us think about like how questions and ideas and the way that they're articulated in these particular texts have a profound impact on the way that we even experience the world. So I often tell my students in just Intro to Political Thought that these are ideas that we are kind of like, even though we don't know them and we're maybe encountering these texts for the first time, they're kind of the air we breathe and the water we drink. It's just kind of like we go through the world with like so-called American ideals of freedom, which are individualist and about sovereignty and autonomy and achievement and success, that denigrate sometimes the ideas of community and care, and I mean, sometimes not. It's more complicated than that, but you know what I mean. So it's important to look at how those questions are framed and how those narratives are constructed in order to understand like how we come to be the kinds of people that we are, how we come to form habits and replicate them unthinkingly, unfeelingly, and those are all contained kind of in this canon that feminists have challenged. So in other words, again, this is too long, but so when you look at a thinker like Plato or Hobbes or any of the canonical thinkers, Machiavelli, Rousseau, and a feminist unpacks something else and gets us to think about that text in a new way, that helps us to see the world a little bit in a new way as well. It just opens up something else. So that's what I think that feminist political thinkers who are reading the canon and canonical texts, adding new voices to the canon as well, that's what I think they're doing for us as an intellectual project. I think that's really related to the political project, because the political project, the movement, the demands, the tracing that we can do, something that you do so incredibly powerfully in your work on the sex wars, is to like think about how all these conversations, these confrontations, these encounters have opened us up to new narratives about what we've been experiencing. And in that sense, I think that the political work, the intellectual work, weirdly, are both doing kind of the same things. They're opening up new narratives. They're getting us to see our lives differently. They're making us aware of things that we hadn't thought about before. We might have feelings about, and we might have really bad feelings about, or we might have good feelings about, or it might be like these kinds of good feelings, but that we can't quite fully experience these good feelings in the way we want them to, like Sarah Ahmed's work on happiness, like we're supposed to be happy, but we're really not, we're kind of unhappy, and why is that? So I think the intellectual project, the political project, are doing kind of weirdly that same kind of work, but in very different and sometimes not intersecting forums. So I often really lament this idea and the fact sometimes that the academic world and the so-called activist world are not in conversation with each other, because I do think
or are hostile toward one another,
even hostile toward one another, because I think there is all this stuff that we can talk about and they learn from each other. So
yeah, I'm thinking as I'm hearing you describe that there can be this temptation to think of scholarship, inquiry, science, whatever, as like cordoned off from the world, from politics. But I think one of the wonderful things about not just feminist political thought, but the study of political thought, period, is it disabuses us of that that notion, because if you're thinking about politics, you are thinking in a worldly way.
You are absolutely thinking in a worldly way, yes. And you're thinking, I guess one of the definitions I like the most of politics, which is itself a difficult kind of thing to pin down, like, what is politics? What's a political action? How do we act politically?
That'll be a separate Zoom video.
I know. Are we engaging in politics when we act violently or not? All those questions, right? So what is politics? But for me, just a simple definition I always come back to of politics is just thinking about how we live together, like literally, just like how we make ourselves cognizant of and co-authors of the rules by which we live together, and the kinds of things that we think our community is for, what we owe each other as community members, how we treat each other. And for me, that's politics. And that is, of course, a very expansive notion of politics. And it's kind of like what you just said, politics is just thinking in a worldly way. So, the intellectual project of making those questions more available to us, more legible to us, easier for us to see, I think is also the work of activism. Because what activism does, so Black Lives Matter has, made people see the history of racism, racist structures, and the kind of everyday habits of racism that a lot of us engage in unthinkingly, it's made those legible. And so it's like the murder of George Floyd was a super visible thing, but like the beating of Rodney King, something that might seem super visible actually isn't visible to all of us, and people see it differently. So it's only when you're shifting kind of the contours of the narrative and the conversation and you're seeing something differently that we can actually engage in conversations about real kinds of change. And I think that an intellectual academic discourse does that in conversation with political activism.
And when you define politics in that capacious way that you just have as, you know, what we're doing when we're trying to live together, I think that it becomes really evident that feminism, which we haven't really talked about yet, but that we can, you know, what its sort of purview is. Feminism, an attentiveness to gender and attentiveness to sexuality and these sorts of aspects, is integral to the project of thinking about politics, because it's an integral part of how we live together, right? Those aspects really inform our experience of sharing the world together, and feminism can foreground those.
I think that is the key aspect of feminism that you've just hit on right there. One of the things I think that makes feminism so tough, one of the things that makes it so invisible, I think, as a kind of thing that we want to do, a kind of conversation that we want to have, is because it's so intimate, because it's about gender, which is a super intimate thing. How we understand what gender we are, how we want to identify as our gender, what kind of sex we're having, what we think about the role of sexuality in our lives, who we love, who we decide to marry, whether marriage is a thing that we even want to engage in, whether we're going to have children, how we're going to raise those children, what kind of values we think those children should have. Those are all feminist questions. Of course, the political questions become kind of manifest, the more explicitly political questions become manifest as like equal rights for marriage, abortion rights, the question of whether we need state-sponsored daycare, whether we need the Family Medical Leave Act. So those become the kind of political articulations, but they're really intimate topics. Whether you're going to end a pregnancy, whether you're going to decide to get married, who you're going to marry, how you identify as a gendered person, who you're going to have sex with, and how, those are the most intimate questions. And those are often ones, and again, that personal is political idea, those are ones that we don't really care to examine. We really don't want to, and or many people don't. I shouldn't speak for everyone, but I think those are hard questions to think about, and it's hard to think about where we even got ideas about those things and why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that becomes sometimes a personal challenge, a personal assault. I think it draws up like really difficult feelings. And so I think feminism is a tough one. And it's hard to think about feminist questions as political questions. Of course, Me Too blew that all up, and we're, helpfully brought to public discussion some of these difficult feelings and relationships and interactions and dynamics that we all know as, sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual violence. But even those become often, without reframing, like Me Too has done a lot of reframing, without that reframing, they become personal. What did I do to attract that attention? What did I do to make it possible to be exploited in the way that I know I am being, but maybe since nobody's talking about it, maybe it's a kind of a shameful thing for me to say out loud. So I think that feminism is so hard because it's so intimate.
Definitely, definitely. I'm thinking perhaps another way in which feminism can assist reflection about politics more broadly. So much of politics is about justice, seeking justice, designing institutions through which we can bring about justice, which is to a large extent about kind of rectifying harm. And one thing that feminism does, in the example of Me Too that you just foregrounded, is it brings into view this kind of very particular class of harms, right? The harm that somebody who is subject to sexual harassment experiences, it's different than having your wallet stolen by a pickpocket on the street, or being a victim of some other sort of wrong or injustice. There, and I think that part of that difference is that it touches a kind of deeply interior part of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And feminism is, as I see it, a plea for redress for harms that have that character and quality.
I 100% agree with you. I think that is integral to what feminist politics is doing, and even feminist political theory, returning to kind of the question of the canon that you're asking about, and like what feminist political theorists are doing when they read political texts and political theory texts in particular. And one kind of thing, like someone like Mary Estelle from way back when was thinking about like how we redefine security. And so to connect this back up with your question of harm, she was expanding the notion of security to include women's security in their own homes, to the kind of list of what does it mean to secure citizens? And when you're thinking only of male citizens, and when you're thinking particularly of a particular kind of male citizens, you're excluding a whole lot of people. You're also excluding children, you're excluding, and even when you're thinking of physical security, they weren't thinking about rape, they weren't thinking about sexual violence, so on and so forth. So like, it just kind of blows your mind. So we're thinking about security, we're thinking about harm, we're thinking about justice. And I do think that there's this kind of like core question of like justice entailing this like way of getting at what we deserve in terms of like redressing some of those kinds of questions. However, I also will say, I think feminism is integrally about that, but it's about so much more, because without that, there's no possibility of even living as a freely thinking, freely moving in the world, freely loving, freely connecting human being. And so it is also about a sense of agency and possibility and imagination and creativity that are impossible without those bare minimums being met. So we have to address those bare minimums, which we've been notoriously terrible at, right? And it wasn't even included in so many of these texts as part and parcel of the idea of justice. Susan Oken, Justice in the Family, addressing Rawls, saying like, you're talking about justice, but you haven't even talked about the family. So if we're going to have, and Carol Pateman, like some of these thinkers, I don't mean to throw out thinkers because I know that my students and your students haven't yet read some of these thinkers, but the idea, I guess, the basic idea about the family is that if you've got a patriarchal family where you have a vision of a family where it's a father, a mother, and children, already troubled by gender norms and not in any way constituted by a queer notion of what love, family, possibility could be. But then an anti-democratic family where one person or even two-person, the parents, make all the decisions. Emma Goldman, Mary Wollstonecraft, so concerned with the rights of children. We're thinking about even the democratic participation of children in the family. What does that look like? How do we learn justice in the family? And when we've grown up learning that you obey authority, you don't become a democratic citizen very easily, because that's what we're not supposed to do. That as democratic citizens, we're supposed to question authority. We're supposed to evaluate our commitments. We're supposed to think about what we're being told. We're supposed to challenge those things. That's what democracy is. And if we haven't had that experience in the family, where do we get that knowledge? Some people only get it for the first time when they go to college, but that's probably a common experience. But it's too bad. We should have more democratic families as well. So, yeah.
So I was trying to keep this short.
Sorry, Lorna.
No, I'm saying that more to myself because I want to ask you like 10,000 more questions and keep talking to you. It's such an exciting opportunity to get to do this. But I do want to kind of wrap it up out of respect for my poor suffering students.
That makes so much sense. Yes.
So the last question I'll ask, I kind of told you before we started recording that, this is probably the first course in feminist political thought that many of my students will have taken. They don't have a lot of, some of them don't have a lot of background in this. So I guess I'll ask you, like, what would you like to tell to those students who are just now embarking on this journey that, you have, devoted a huge swath of your life to, right, professionally? What message would you like to give them as they set out to discover this exciting realm?
Well, first I'll say that you are amazingly lucky to have Lorna as your professor, or Dr. B or Professor B. What do you go by, Lorna?
Whatever they call me, I don't know.
You answer to lots of names. That's good. I do too. But in any case, they're so lucky to have you. And I looked at your syllabus and it's fantastic. You guys are going to learn so much. So this is an amazing opportunity. So please embrace it. And I guess my only thing is just to be open. I actually, when I teach my students for the first time in feminist political thought or feminist film or feminist anything, one thing I notice, and I've, again and again and again, and for me too, it happens to me as well. Like, and I'm sure it happens to you, Lorna, like these ideas are like, again, I touched on this earlier, but I think they're threatening. I think they're scary. And I think it's really okay to acknowledge that. I think that it's helpful to acknowledge how scary they are sometimes. I think they're wonderful ideas, and they're wonderful ways in which we can newly see our lives and maybe change some of our practices and our behaviors in relationship to them, engage in politics differently too. But I do think that they can be kind of foreign, because they are looking at things that sometimes we don't want to examine. So I just, if you can keep an open mind about that and just acknowledge your own fears about it, but kind of move on anyway, I think that's the most important thing.
That's such excellent advice. I needed to hear that as well, because these ideas continue to be threatening and scary to me often.
Me too. I know. Yes, every time.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Marso, for being so generous with your time and talking with us today.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun, Lorna. You're fantastic, and I'm so excited for your book to be out in the world.
Oh my gosh.
I love your work and have the greatest respect for you. So your students are extremely lucky.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.